Shalom, everybody. I'm not sure whether to say good morning or good afternoon or good evening, so let's say all three. In the chat room, we have greetings in both versions, all versions of that. There are people here from India, from Uruguay, from Hungary, from Australia, from Greece, Poland, even Iceland, France, the UK, Croatia, Austria, Taiwan, the United States, Vienna, Austria, and Ireland as well so far. There's somebody from Germany and Israel, people from Israel as well. And I'm sure if I carry on down the list, we'll see more countries as well. My name is Cyril Brightman. I'm the director of the English language desk at Yad Vashem's International Relations Division. And it's our pleasure today to welcome you to this lecture on the daily struggle for existence in the Lodz ghetto presented by Orit Margaliot. Orit studied history as well as art history at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She's currently pursuing an MA in Holocaust Studies. Orit has worked at Yad Vashem's International School for Holocaust Studies since 2000, where she ran the desks of several countries in the European department. She headed the Polish desk for 13 years and was also the coordinator for the Learning Center at Block 27 in the Auschwitz Museum. Orit is currently the head of training, professional development and curricula at the International Schools Educational Guiding Department, and also is a member of the staff for the Guides Course to Poland. Martin, would you please take down the slide and then Orit can begin. Orit, all yours.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. And I'm very excited to have this opportunity to speak to you today. I twisted a little the title of my presentation. We'll still deal with the same topic, but I wanted to title it with also the tools I'm going to use as part of my presentation, and that is speaking about the history and the daily struggle in Łódź ghetto from what is reflected in photography and in art from the time. I want to just say one thing before I start. You are more than welcome to write down your questions in the chat, but I will refer to them, or as many as I'll have time at the end of my presentation and not during, but feel free to write down and I'll leave time for that at the end. When we want to speak about the limitations of the tools I'm just going to use, before moving to speaking about Łódź ghetto itself, the most important thing that we'll have to see regarding the presentation of the history, if through the lens of the camera or through the art, is who actually photographed or painted, why have they done so, and how did they have the means, and also how did they survive and reached us. And from that, we're moving to Łódź itself. When we speak about Łódź, Poland, it's important to remember that we're speaking of a relatively new modern city. At the end of the 18th century, it inhabited only 200 people, 11 of them were Jews. But on World War II Eve, 1/3 of the population of the city, approximately 233,000 people, were Jews. And we speak about a very vibrant life and people voting to all Jewish and non-Jewish political parties. We're speaking of people who were hard Labor Day workers, in the meaning of many of them were working as part of the main symbol of also the city in textile. This is a city that is known as the Manchester of Poland. And in this way was developed and also brought it into expanding into becoming the second largest city in interwar Poland throughout the 19th century and into the 20th. When we want to come and tell this story of Łódź ghetto, the focal question that we will have to ask is, how did a place that once the Nazi regime will occupy this place and annex it to Germany, how did this ghetto that was supposed to survive or to exist for 6 months only is actually the last ghetto to survive on Polish soil, occupied Poland, in occupied Poland, till the August 1944. And in order to start and to answer that, you can see in front of you, and also we received some questions beforehand, and this will enable me also to refer to them. You can see here the map of the ghettos as defined by Yad Vashem according to the Encyclopedia of Ghettos, which came out a few years ago. And one of the things that you can see is, of course, the first thing is the partition of Poland. Once Poland is occupied in September Act 1939, and the fact that Eastern Poland becomes part of the Soviet Union, which is actually not 1/3, but 51% of the country, while Western Poland is annexed directly to the Third Reich. And only the interpart, which is known as the general government, becomes the occupied region that will be under the general governor of Hans Frank. When Łódź is occupied, it's occupied on the 8th day of the war. There's a huge flight of people towards the east to the unoccupied territories. Maybe this way they can join also the army as well as flee the German occupation. But as we know, to state very clearly, the German occupation is rapid. In a month, Poland is fully occupied and also divided between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. At the beginning, Łódź is supposed to be part of the general government area. But due to its characteristics, because this is a textile city, because it has much economy to add to economical value to add to the Third Reich, it is eventually annexed as well to Nazi Germany as part of this whole Western region, as you can see over here. The first purpose of this region is to be cleansed of Jews and Poles. This is its purpose. The idea is because it's annexed to Nazi Germany and you have a very high population of Volksdeutsche, of German ethnicity descendants. Therefore, the idea is also to bring ethnical Germans from the other occupied areas from the east into this area and to cleanse this area from Poles and Jews. But this idea eventually will collapse as Hans Frank will refuse to receive into the occupied area of the general government any more population, since he has already a very high number of Jews as well as of Poles in this territory. The key man of this area is Artur Greiser. He's the Gauleiter, he's the man in charge of this area, and he understands clearly also what he wants to accomplish. Anti-Jewish legislation takes place, and we already hear by the end of December 1939, Ibenhau, who is the governor of Łódź, who says the purpose is to cleanse from this epidemic Łódź, and therefore to expel them as fast as possible from this area. In order to enable a faster deportations of Jews to the designated area for where the ghetto will be established, a pogrom takes place already in February 1940. And so eventually the ghetto that will be established in a very poor area of the city that lacks 65% of it lacks sanitarian conditions. Baluti, till today a very poor area in Łódź. By April 30th, May 1st, 1940, the ghetto will be closed. And one of the main characteristics of this ghetto is its total isolation. There will be hardly connection with outside of the ghetto. And how is that done? I'm bringing here, first of all, photographs which were taken by one of the German officials in the ghetto, a man by the name of Walter Gennewein, who was the head of the economical department, German economical department, of course, in the ghetto. And his hobby was to photograph, and he is recruited by the man that we will speak of in a few seconds, Hans Bibov, who is in charge of the ghetto, to photograph the life in the ghetto in order to prepare it for an exhibition of the Jews, on the Jews of Łódź ghetto. Eventually, this exhibition did not happen, but he continued to photograph till the liquidation of the ghetto in the summer of 1944. Now you can see from these photos, first of all, there are colorful photos, which already gives us a different maybe perception of the reality. But you can see also a very important person here in that meaning, and we'll have to ask regarding his limitations of centrality, and that is Mordechai Chaim Mordechai Rumkowski, who will be nominated eventually to head the Jewish leadership of Łódź Jews and also later on in the ghetto. In order to follow in this short time that we have the history and the daily experience in Łódź Ghetto, I would like to use the words of Israel Kaliski, later on Aviram, who was born in 1926 to a Hasidic family in Łódź, had also a younger sister, a religious family. And when he used to tell his, give his testimony, he used to speak about 5 plagues. He used to say there were 10 plagues in Egypt, 5 plagues in Łódź Ghetto. And this is the way to understand, maybe in a more simplified way, the daily life in Łódź Ghetto. The first problem that he speaks of is isolation. Because of the locality of this ghetto, which is in an area that is annexed to the Third Reich, the idea is to disconnect the Jewish population from all their surroundings. And it's done in a couple of ways. The first thing, this is one of the few ghettos that we know of, that if people came close or less than 10 meters to the fence that surrounded the ghetto, they were shot dead. So already the boundaries are much more clear. Another thing that will develop eventually, which will be a key factor of this ghetto, the work aspect, that this will become a working ghetto. All the work of the ghetto will be concentrated within the ghetto eventually. Nothing will be outside of the ghetto, like if we compare it, for example, to Warsaw Ghetto, which was the largest ghetto under the Nazi occupation, where you had placówkas who went also outside of the ghetto and so on. Here you do not have that possibility. The isolation is total, and therefore also there are no smugglers of food. And moreover, if someone was found with a newspaper from the outside in his hands, he could have been also severely tortured by the Kripo, by the criminal German police, who was in the ghetto in order to try and see what do they know. So obtaining information was also very problematic. I'll add to that one more factor regarding this isolation, because another factor that we will find that is relatively unique to this ghetto, we don't have many ghettos who share this characteristic, that in order to also confiscate Jewish money, and as well as to isolate the Jews, the ghetto will have its own money. And so even if someone somehow manages to flee the ghetto, he has no fundings, no ways to find how to cope with the reality outside. So all of these factors of isolation are acute in the understanding also of what we will see as daily life in the ghetto. Another thing that he speaks of, and you can see this isolation, by the way, by this photograph, one of 3 bridges, which connected the 2 sides of the ghetto, while the road underneath is actually a Polish/German one, right? And this is something we have to remember. So the isolation is total in that way. When we speak about the difficult conditions, we have to remember that this, as I said, lacks 65% of the whereabouts of the ghetto. In total, we're speaking about a little more than 4 square kilometers, but only 2.3 square kilometers are fit for residential needs. And add to that, that most of the houses do not have running water within, do not have utilities, the fact that there are no sewer system in the ghetto. And this is how you can see that there are special groups that their work is to evacuate the excrements from the houses into this place, to the boundary of the ghetto. And we're coming to the second plague also that Israel Aviram mentions, and that is the hunger. As we said, there are no smugglers, no way to bring in food from without. One of the challenges that we can see, and you can see here the vegetable market, is that the food that is provided by the Germans is originally food that is, most of it is not suitable for eating. If we're speaking about beet, if we speak of even for flour for bread that is not full of flour, but also problematic. And so already the first conditions dictate what will happen later, a very high rate of mortality. This ghetto will have the highest rate of mortality out of all the ghettos, 21%. And we have the accurate number of those who perished in the ghetto, 43,734 people, 1/4 of the population of the ghetto. That's a very high number. One of the things that also we know, and we have diaries of anonymous teenagers from the time, One of them, a teenager, writes on March 10th, 1942, the following: her food ration is 200 grams a day. And this is what she writes. I'm waiting that my father will go to work, and then I jump out of bed and I eat all the bread that mother had left me for the whole day. God, what happened to me? I wish they knew how to hold it in. God, have pity on me. All the day I drink water with vinegar that was left from the beets and then waiting till 7 p.m. Today, they are distributing bread. I stood 3 hours in line and received 3 loaves of bread. On my way back, I took part of the bread. Whose bread am I eating? This is part of the greatest challenges and dilemmas that we find. Shmuel Gal describes how his mother hid a sack of sugar for difficult times. And one day the sack of sugar is gone. And he sees his mother falling apart. This was for the worst time, kept aside, and it's gone. And she doesn't know who stole it. He survived. And years later, he gave testimony at Yad Vashem, and he said, I knew who stole that sack. It was my brother. But I never told my mother, and I never told him. And this also shows the great difficulty, the struggle, the daily struggle. How do you live? Israel Aviram used to say in his testimony, we cannot really understand what hunger, what starvation is. Starvation is the 24/7. You are haunted by this notion, by this feeling. You sleep, you're hungry. You're awake, you're hungry. And he used to say, the only place I forgot of my hunger for an hour or two was when I was in the youth movement. And that was his greatness. But how do you deal with this hunger that walks with you, you carry with you wherever you go? You can see here a few examples of the different institutions, Jewish institutions within the ghetto as part of the Judenrat, if we're speaking about a Jewish courthouse, and you can see it over here as well. If we're speaking about the Jewish firefighters, because of course, sometimes fires break. And we can see even at times when it was allowed, we have also a postman, Yechiel Isaac Levkovich here, distributing mail in the ghetto. And for times, of course, this was forbidden. But the fact when you do have communication with the outside enables some understanding or some hope regarding also your loved ones, which are not with you within. And I'd like to take a moment to speak here about these children. And you can see here the children standing in line for food. One of the things that Chaim Rumkowski had took as a mission, due to the fact that also he was a director of a Jewish orphanage before the war, was to put the children's interest, at least at the beginning, as much as possible up front and high in the hierarchy. And the way that it was done already, once the war occurs, Łódź is occupied, schools are closed, and one of the first things that he also tries to bring back is the education. When the ghetto is founded, we find in the area of Marishin, we find also in different buildings, schools are assembled. At the first year, most of the children and youth do not go to the schools. But what we find later on, this will come also a haven for the children. The meaning of a haven, not only that this is where you flee your troubles because you have a possibility to deal with something else, but also he decides that they will receive an additional ration of food, additional soup bowl and bread for those who go to the school system. And it comes about that by October 1941, we can speak of 45 different schools who are activated in the ghetto. We have two kindergartens, 2 high schools, 1 vocational school, and 40 primary schools. And they keep on going till October 1941, when will arrive approximately 20,000 deportees from the Reich, i.e. from Germany, from Austria, and from the Protectorate, what we know today as Czech Republic. They will be deported to this area, and therefore they will need the buildings to house them, and the schools will be closed. But one more thing that takes place, which is important regarding the children, is that we can find also children colonies. And the children colony in Marishin will comprise mostly of children that lost their parents. And we're speaking about approximately 2,000 children that the Judenrat will find the funds to take care of them, and they will stay in the ghetto till the summer, till September 1942, and we'll speak about this turning point as we go on. This is the German official most important in the ghetto, Hans Bibow. Once the ghetto is closed, Chaim Ronkowski, who knows that he has many working hands in his under him, he turns to the Germans and tells them, I have a mine gold. All you need to do is bring me back the machines and we will work for you. And all I'm asking in return is to receive food rations so they will survive. His fear is that people will perish out of lack of conditions. Nobody meets his request. Only in the summer, when Hans Bibow, who was a successful coffee merchant from Hamburg, who is nominated as the key figure who is in charge of the ghetto from the German civil system, he will understand the mine gold that he has there, the gold mine that he has there, the possibilities, how much money he can also gain, and not only to the Third Reich. And having Eberhard as well as Arthur Greiser, the Gauleiter of the whole area, also taking part of this. And this is how factories will be established. And if at the end of 1940, we're speaking of approximately 30 factories, by 1943, 95% of the inhabitants of the ghetto are working. Working meaning 12 hours a day on different factories that we will see in a second. And this brings into the Third Reich's treasury more than 4 million Reichsmark, not including what these specific officials take, of course, to their own pocket in their own initiative. And so what we can see from the different works or places of work that the Jews will work within and will expand with time, you can see here the use of straw. You can see here a display of clothing that was sewn in the ghetto. We're speaking about weaving workshops, furniture workshops, saddle workshops, carpets, building materials, again, sewing. And one of the maybe important things is what you can see here, because Łódź Ghetto will provide 1/4 of the needs of the Wehrmacht, of the German army. To that extent, they become essential for the war effort. This is something very important. You can see here just the caps of the different soldiers, but this is definitely very important, the understanding also of the German interest. And if I place at the beginning of the question, how did a ghetto that was supposed to last for 6 months, merely 6 months, eventually will last 4.5 till the end of the summer of 1944, this is the key reason. Because there will be constantly from 1942 struggles between the SS, the ideological wing of the Third Reich that will say annihilation above all, and the economical and warfare office led by Albert Speer that will say, no, we need them for the war effort and therefore they should live. And with time, different hands, different office is stronger. Eventually, as we know to say, is the ghetto will be liquidated, the SS will win, but this still shows us a very important factor in the question of survival. It could be many times when we speak about the Holocaust, we speak about the Jews not being passive, and Jews were not passive. Jews were very active in daily decisions how to survive. But the question of their impact of dictating the outcome of their choices, they actually live with choiceless choices because the group that will decide eventually if they have the chances to survive or not are the occupiers, are the Germans. And therefore, this is very important, the understanding also in the struggle and daily struggle for life and death, for survival, and for the question of what the future holds. And I'm just giving you a few more photos here of impression. And you can see here also that the cemetery was part of the ghetto area. And this is the second largest Jewish cemetery in Poland. And this is something, again, important because think how much territory it held out of the ghetto area. For those who still kept on being religious and observing, and although it was forbidden officially, but still you can see also that. And culture, and the places of books maybe serving as a escapism in coping as well with reality. I want to, one more thing to mention here, and then we'll move into Jewish representation. What you can see here, again, is a very specific characteristic connected to Łódź Ghetto, and that is that between November 1941 and January 5th, 1942, there was a gypsy camp in the ghetto, approximately 5,000 Sinti and Roma who was kept in the ghetto area. And you can see here the houses, but they were fully separated from the Jewish inhabitants, and they were the first ones to be also deported from there to Chelmno, to Kulmhof Nadner, to be murdered. I'm reminding you, as we spoke about the different plagues that Israel Aviram has mentioned, we spoke about oscillation, we spoke about starvation, the overcrowdedness, just to understand, we're speaking in a very small area, as we said, in its peak, it was a little more than 4 square kilometers, but only 2.3 possible for residents. In its peak, 164,000 Jews were enclosed, were imprisoned in Łódź Ghetto. Altogether, 202,000 passed through the ghetto throughout the years of its existence. And the overcrowdedness is not a unique factor for the ghetto, but it definitely enhances the difficulties of coping with the harsh reality. But there's another thing. And again, this is not something that is necessarily unique to Łódź Ghetto, but is also important in the understanding of the reality and the daily coping, and that is the frost, the cold. A Polish winter, and those that I saw here that are from Poland can testify themselves, what is a Polish winter? When we speak about the fact that temperatures can drop even 30 below zero, even if there's coal, you need to have fire, you need to have wood, you need to have the supplies in order to warm the house. Israel Aviram describes how the cold used to creep on you. People came back from the factory, from the resort. They used to sit for a second on the pavement and never rose again. When people went to the toilets, which were not part of the buildings, they had to go out of the building. If they went out in the middle of the night, sometimes they or broke a leg on the frost, or and couldn't get up, and then had remained there, and who knew if they lived through the night, or even in the toilets themselves. This just shows another great difficulty that they had to face. Okay, and I'm jumping forward with your permission to the last thing that is connected to the special population in the ghetto. And that is what you can see here, those trains that brought in approximately 20,000 Jews from the Reich to Łódź Ghetto in October 1941. From Germany, from Austria, and from the Protectorate, from what we know as Czech Republic today. And you can see, first of all, the trains, and you can see their clothing. And if you are familiar with the relationship between the Ostjuden and the Westjuden, the Jews from the East, from Eastern Europe, and the Jews of Western Europe, before World War II and the Holocaust, definitely the relationship was not an easy one, definitely also for some till today. I can testify 7 parts of 8 Polish. This is not something that necessarily is being accepted easily in a family, in a Jewish family. But at this time here, something changes. And if Polish Jews, and specifically Łódź Jewry, that many of them in this ghetto were workers, and therefore they were they got accustomed, you can say, relatively fast to the conditions in the ghetto. For the Westjuden, for the Jews who were deported from the Reich, this was a huge challenge. And we can see also in testimonies of those who haven't survived, but became very centered in the ghetto, like Oskar Zinger, who arrived from Prague, or Oskar Rosenfeld, who arrived from Germany as well, who describe, and they will become known figures because they will be part of the chronicles of Łódź Ghetto, of depicting the daily life officially as part of the Judenrats institutions. And they will describe the difficulties and what do they do? How do you cope with the frost, with the starvation, with the loss of status, and also with the difficult relationships with the Ostjuden. And we can find different relations also in by the inhabitants, the original inhabitants of Łódź, who describe also how they seem to them as if they are with air, and therefore who are they to come with us with demands? And it just shows the complexity of also the internal relations within the ghetto. They will be also among those who will be deported from the ghetto to Chełmno, and we find the first ones to be deported. We will find deportations taking place from January 1942 until May. Approximately 55,000 people, Jews, will be deported, and in April 1942 will be the majority also of those Reich Jews who were imprisoned in this ghetto. Okay, and we're speaking about the Jewish struggle. I want to share with you one artist in that matter, Jewish artist who lived within the ghetto, and this is Israel Eizerovich. Israel Eizerovich was a renowned, was a very well-known artist in pre-war Poland, in interwar Poland. He was disabled, but it didn't hold him back, and he presented his art throughout Poland from 1920 onwards. In the ghetto, and you can see here his self-portrait, in the ghetto, his official position was working in the office that was connected to the research of the Jewish question that was led by Hans Bibov. But he held also a clandestine salon for artists in different languages, German, Polish, Yiddish, and probably also Russian, in order to help them maintain their dignity and their humanity. You can see also how he had access to materials. His patron was Chaim Romkowski, and this is how he had access to canvases as well as to colors. And you can see here his paying tribute to that and his own photograph. But you can see, I want to take you through, and we'll do the same thing later on with Jewish photography with the time that we'll have left, through the prism from how a person depicts himself, from the most inner circle of his family, into expanding it to the people surrounding him. And you can see here how, you can see here his studio. As every established artist, this is something that you want to center. You can see here his mother in the ghetto. And look at her face, that you can see which daily worries she carries. You can see her here as well. And look at his father. This painting is from the beginning of the time of the ghetto, and you can see how he's well dressed and maintains his posture. And look what happens to him when time passes in the ghetto, how he describes them afar, how he becomes so small. And this is his sister. And he pays here tribute also to one maybe of the paintings that you are familiar with from the 17th century of Vermeer. But you can see here with how much love, and also the question, how do you pass time when you don't work? And for those who do not work within. And sometimes even this can be a way of coping. He describes her also here as a saint, like a Christian icona that you can see here. And he describes from that also the whereabouts of the ghetto. And you can see here, and maybe this is the greatness of painting, you can see through the trees in the sky, the atmosphere when you come out to the street. You can see the houses, the broken down houses that people have to live within. And you can see the people also working, and this is his depiction of those who work in the commando that has to evacuate the excrements because of the lack of storage. And maybe, and this is just an assumption, the choice of not presenting them, the majority, with their faces in order to maintain their dignity as well. And of course, what characterizes the daily life as well very much, funerals. Funerals because of the very high rate of mortality. And this image relates to the question of Chaim Romkowski and his possibility to really affect the daily life of the Jews in the ghetto. You can see here the bridge that we have seen before in Genevein's photo. And we can see here the children. And from one hand, they are seeking for refuge or for help by Romkowski. On the other hand, you can see how he's pulling his coat from these children that are begging. And when you try to understand or to figure out who Chaim Romkowski was, if in the past people used to see him in a very dichotomic way, he was collaborating with the Nazis and so on, today we have to speak of something much more complex than that, because Chaim Romkowski truly believed that he can make a difference. He truly believed that he can save part of the people. And therefore, he followed that way, even if it meant to turn in those who don't have the chances to survive. And we'll see that how that is also much more is expressed with the turning point of the ghetto. I'm bringing just these images, these last images, which we don't know who these people are, because we have the tendencies of narrating the stories of those who survived, of left testimony behind. But when we tell the story of the Holocaust, many times we don't have the names. We don't know the stories of many. And therefore, the representation of them, and here we see it by art by Leizerovich, at least enables to give them a face in this reality. Israel Leizerovich was deported with the liquidation of the ghetto in the summer of 1944 and was murdered. His paintings survived due to two ways. One, by Nachman Zonband, who was an activist in the ghetto and survived and also retrieved them, but also his sister who survived and gave them to the JICH, to the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, where the majority of his art is still today kept. Very little of his art is also at Yad Vashem's collections. And this brings me, with the time that I have left, to deal with two very important photographers within the ghetto that will also enable us to expand our discussion regarding the situation and the struggle for survival in the ghetto. And you can see here Mendel Grossman and Henrik Ross. And you can see here how a selfie is taken in the ghetto. And if today this is something common and that definitely teenagers more even seek in order to present themselves, think to what extent this has importance in a time of dehumanization. When you photograph yourself in front of a mirror in order to re-identify yourself, to maintain your identity and your dignity. Mendel Grossman, as you can see, was born in 1917, and he was a pioneer in photography. In 1938, he was recruited by the Jewish health organization TOS in order to, in Poland, to document the childcare, the Jewish childcare in Poland. He was a pioneer in photography because he was the first one to photograph, not from the crowd, the stage, but from the backstage, the people. He had a very unique sight and understanding of how to present reality. And he was foreseen with a very successful and bright future. Of course, this changes with the break of the war and the establishment of the ghetto. And he's recruited by Chaim Romkowski to be part of the staff of the statistics department and to also photograph, and this is how he had access to a camera as well as to a lab, to photograph all the work efforts within the ghetto in order to market it properly to the Germans. So more Germans will want to employ the ghetto inhabitants, and so they will last for a longer period of time. But what he would do is also document secretly. And again, I would like to start with his family story and from that depiction and to expand it to the story of the ghetto. You can see here his mother in the ghetto, his father, and it's not a coincidence. And this is a very, I think, difficult photo because you can see the father eating and the meaning of food, as I tried a little to express before, in the context of the ghetto. And the father also, you can see his how he becomes weaker, and also before he was executed in the ghetto here with his with the tefillin. This is his sister, Ruzhka Grossman, who will be also the solemn survivor of the whole family. And you can see here this photo, and look how normal it seems holding a cat, but having the mark as a Jew. And here you can see the official photography of the different statistics and work in the ghetto. One of the things that Rumkowski understood the importance is creating different albums to market the merchandise of the ghetto, and you can see him here working in that way, but also depicting the daily life. And you can see how Chaim Rumkowski becomes central, opening different sports events. But he uses these photos too much also for his own use, the camera. And therefore, he receives this letter in December 1941 from Rumkowski. I inform you herewith that you are not allowed to work in your profession for private purposes. Your photographic work is confined only to the activity in the department in which you are employed. You are therefore strictly prohibited to do any photographic work. Now, of course, he will be severely punished if it will be found, but this doesn't hold him back. He has a special bag where he puts the camera in and walks through the ghetto depicting the daily life. You can see here a Purim celebration. You can see again the Scheisse Kommando, those who are evicting the excrements. And you can see here also, and this is a collage, but a very important photo, which shows one of the tragedies of Łódź ghetto inhabitants. Because as I mentioned before, deportation starts to take place to Chełmno from January 1942. But at first, people are being deported of all ages. And therefore, they are sure those who remain behind that they are being really deported for resettlement for work. Not only that, they receive 10 Reichsmark to accompany them on their way, and many times the German force them to write postcards, and they are sent from within the Reich back into the ghetto, and people can identify the writing of their loved ones, and this ensures them that they actually just moved to a different place. What you can see here is the interior of the Maria Church, which was within the ghetto area, where the victim's property belongings was brought back and was here sorted. And this question, what happens to the people, is a question that is asked on one hand by some, but to what extent can you fully comprehend that murder takes place if this is the most inconceivable thing that has ever happened? And therefore, this photo definitely carries this. You can see here the pulpit, along with all the Jewish belongings to be sorted. You can see here the distribution of the bread, that parts of it was actually made of cut wood. The struggle facing the hunger. And one of the maybe unique characteristics of Łódź ghetto regarding the burial. Because when we speak about burying the 1/5 of the inhabitants of the ghetto, it is a conscious decision to mark their graves. Till today, those who arrive to Łódź and arrive to Łódź Jewish Cemetery can see in the plains in the same cemetery and locate exactly where the people they know have perished in the ghetto and buried within the ghetto. Now, this is amazing. If you compare it, for example, to Warsaw Ghetto, where because of the high numbers, people are buried in 3 mass graves. Here, they keep the individual burial of each. And you can see the way to recognize it till today is because also of the documentation by Mendel Grossman of each grave on it for its own. And if we want to understand this work of Grossman, this is how it was depicted by a close friend. Mendel takes out his camera. No more flowers, clouds, natures, stills, or landscapes. Amid the horror all around him, he has found his destiny. A photograph and leave behind a testimony for all generations about the great tragedy unfolding before his eyes. And we mentioned the plagues. This is the 5th plague, and these are the deportations. And you can see here, the reason we can see here Mendel Grossman photographing is because he was photographed here by a friend. But usually, of course, the camera was hid. And you can see here the Radegast, Radagosh, the train station from where the Jews of Łódź ghetto were deported to Chełmno throughout 1942. And the first transports also in June 1944. And this moment depicts this last separations, bidding farewell, very expressive photos of saying goodbye. The second photographer, I'll just close maybe the story of Grossman. Grossman was deported with the liquidation of the ghetto in the summer of 1944 to Auschwitz-Birkenau. From there, he perished on one of the death marches. His photos, which were the films, which were hidden, were retrieved at the end of the war, and his sister brought them with her when she came here to Palestine, later on the state of Israel. During one of the battles against Egypt in southern Israel, those 9,000 photos, negatives, fell into the Egyptian hands and were lost. Only those photos, we're speaking 9,000, that's a lot of documentation. Only those who had replicas from before are the ones that we have today to present and to see how the ghetto was documented by him. And the last person and the last 3 minutes I have that before I open to questions that I would like to dedicate here is to this man, Henry Gross, who was a little older than Grossman. And he was also in the statistics department in the ghetto working. He had his camera hid instead of a button where the lens could have a good point of view, and this way documented the life in the ghetto. And this is what he said. He survived. So we have his actual words. He testified also in Eichmann's trial in 1961. And this is how he describes also how this footage remained. Just before the closure of the ghetto in 1944, I buried my negatives in the ground in order that there should be some record of our tragedy, namely the total elimination of the Jews from Łódź by the Nazi executioners. I was anticipating the total destruction of Polish Jewry. I wanted to leave an historical record of our martyrdom. And as we speak of his footage, you can see here the retrieving of the footages at the end of the war. And the problem was that some of them were affected by the climate, and therefore some of them were damaged. But look what he depicts. First of all, you can see the expulsion to the ghetto. And as we said, the majority there were working with sewing machines. So you can see them carrying their Zinger machines, those who were not confiscated, into the ghetto. This is again the expulsion to the ghetto in 1940. You can see the work in the ghetto. You can see daily life, and you can see already how the footage here was damaged by the climate, but you can see daily life that kept on going in spite of the harsh conditions. And children playing also policemen. Even though policemen sometimes had a problematic image, for children playing thieves and policemen kept on being a game, popular game. And this is the turning point that will also bring us to an end in the understanding also of the life in the ghetto for the inhabitants. In the beginning of September 1942, as we said already, 55,000 people have been deported to Chelmno, but people do not know regarding the destination anything. On September 1st and 2nd, the hospitals are evicted to Chelmno, and on September 4th, 1942, Chaim Rumkowski assembles in the Firefighters Brigade Square the people of the ghetto and asks them the worst of all. He asks them to give the children till the age of 10 and all the ill people. As he asks the people, it's documented at the time with the screams out of the public. How can you ask for those who cannot work? If till now they believe that the deportations are for work, why do you need children beneath the age of 10 and all the sick people? David Brin was at the time 11 years old, used to describe in his testimony how the first thing that he felt was relief because he was 11 years old. But this is a very crucial moment in the history of the ghetto. Chaim Rumkowski says, this question that has to lead us is not how many we're going to lose, but how many can be saved. We must cut the lid from the body in order to save the body. Of course, the majority of the inhabitants do not surrender their children or their ill relatives. But the Germans enter as well, and they collect altogether 15,681 people. Out of them, almost 6,000 are children under the age of 10. This is a turning point in the history of the ghetto because for the first time, people understand that there's something to question much more. But also the status of Rumkowski is harmed because Rumkowski, who understood where this is facing, where this is going to face, started to bring into the factories children and unproductive elements. And therefore the Germans still maintain his position as the chairman of the Judenrat, of the Jewish leadership, but they bring forward David Gertler, who's the head of the Zonder, of a small Jewish group of actually collaborators with the Nazis, but he is also the head of the supply in the ghetto, and they relate to him, and Yakubovich also, who's in charge of all the work structure of the ghetto. So officially, Rumkowski will remain in his position, but in the eyes of the Germans, he loses much of his status. And you can see here, the deportation of the children in that tragic, harsh moment. And after that, there's a stabilization period in the ghetto that will last till the summer of 1944, when the ghetto will be liquidated because the SS will win over the economical idea, and therefore the ghetto will be liquidated. And this is what you can see here. And I want to end just with 4 photos. There was also love in the ghetto. Life kept going on. Therefore, also those who were willing to risk themselves for those who were observant, as you can see here. Humor was there as well. Look at how in such primitive ways, but you can create also something that raises a smile. Relations between people. And these deportations, we have from Eichmann Schreil the documentation, the testimony of Henry Cross, who describes how he enters the barrack there in the train station documenting, because this is the last moment. These are the negatives, executions. And I want to end with this photo. Approximately 1,000 Jews are left behind. 70,000 are deported in the summer of 1944 mainly to Auschwitz-Birkenau, from which survived the largest Jewish community in all of Poland. The estimations vary between 7,000 to 10,000 Jews. Is it due to Chaim Rumkowski? Probably due more to the German interest. But if I'll use also the words of Israel Aviram, who used to say, if Chaim Omkovsky would have survived, and I would have, and people would have circled him to stone him, I would have stood among those in the circle, but I wouldn't have thrown the first stone out of the understanding of what he tried to do in this period of time. So I'm stopping here, and I see that there are many, many questions in the chat as well. So I'll try to answer maybe some, as our time is not very long, but I will try to answer some of them. Okay, so just 1 second, I'll go through. Okay, there's a question here regarding different responses in the daily struggle of both genders. This is a good question. One of the things we do find in the ghetto period, and this is true not only to Łódź ghetto, but in general in ghettos, is that sometimes men kept indoors more because they were much more targeted for abuse by the Germans. And this is why women suddenly stood up, took a step forward, and were much more active. I'll try to exemplify that, not from Łódź ghetto. You know what, I'll give an example from Łódź ghetto regarding that, and also from Warsaw ghetto. In one of the enterprises, again, unique to Łódź ghetto, is the writing of the Encyclopedia of the Ghetto. In 1944, a few of the intellectuals of the ghetto created the Encyclopedia of the Ghetto that had two purposes. For one hand, to define terminology unique to the ghetto, out of the understanding that the ghetto has changed life as we know it. And the second, having special entries and key figures who lived in the ghetto. And in one of these entries, in terminology, they define the housewives. And there they say about the housewives, the anonymous housewives of the ghetto, we have to give them their place because they're the ones who struggle for the family existence. Without them, families would have not survived. Israel Aviram says as well, if my mother wouldn't have kept a very strong hand in the distribution of the food, as the rations of food were given not daily, but every week or 10 days, we wouldn't have survived. We lived the ghetto time due to her. So this is one thing. The second thing that is important to mention in that, and that is not only from Łódź ghetto, but actually a testimony that we have from the clandestine archive of Warsaw ghetto, from Ringelblum's archive, Oneg Shabbat archive, and that is again the depiction regarding women in the ghetto, where it states the Jewish woman is central in the fact that when the war will end, she will not be able to go back into the kitchen. Things have changed. The war has changed life circumstances and brought the women forward. So I'm answering briefly. I hope I'm touching upon these questions that you're asking, but still in order to try and cover a few more. Let me see, just 1 second. I'm trying to skim through. Okay, there's a question here of researching family members and so on, descendants of Łódź. So you have one way is doing it through Yad Vashem, but if you want to look much more thoroughly, turn to the Jewish community in Łódź. There's an active Jewish community there. They have the documentation that goes back also because of the municipality documentation of Łódź. You can turn to them. They have the, those of you who are descendants of Łódź Jews might know this, that there's a very active website of the Association of the Landsmannschaft of Łódź Jews, which is again one of the largest, if not the largest one of that we know of, that is still very active today. And they have many people who aid in that, in searching also for genealogy information and so on. 1 second, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to read through the questions. There was a previous question also regarding commonalities and differences between Vilnius ghetto and Łódź ghetto. And it's important to understand when we speak about the phenomena of ghettos, we do not speak about the ghetto phenomena, but the phenomena of ghettos, meaning that we can't speak of only one type of ghettos. In the past, this was the consensus. There was an image only of the Nazi ghetto as a whole. Today, we know after the bringing together the Encyclopedia of Ghettos that you can find that Yad Vashem has published. And you can find also another Encyclopedia of Ghettos by Washington Museum, Holocaust Museum as well. Today, Yad Vashem defined a little more than 1,100 different ghettos which were established under the Nazi regime. And therefore, this is something that is important because we're speaking of the fact that there are different types of ghettos. They always served as a transit solution, but according to the war, the way it proceeded, also the role of the ghetto has changed. And therefore, also the daily conditions derived from that. And Łódź ghetto is the most extreme ghetto regarding the confinement, regarding the isolation, regarding the lack of knowledge, regarding what took place outside of the ghetto and the destination of the deportees. But in Vilnius ghetto, just because there was a specific question regarding Vilnius, there was a period of time that you can get food in the Vilnius ghetto that wasn't available for the non-Jews outside of the ghetto, to that extent, okay? So we have to understand that we cannot generalize when we speak about ghettos and the conditions, and we have to look within each ghetto. There are commonalities many times, but not always they're fully overlapping. Someone asked about the photos. These photographs, all the photos that I used are taken from Yad Vashem's archive. All of them are available online, so you can definitely go online and use them. Okay, details regarding those who are buried in the Jewish cemetery of Łódź in the ghetto area. Everything today, if I'm not mistaken, is online through the Landsmannschaft of Łódź. You have the map of the ghetto plains as well as the names. There's a very nice, helpful lady who sits in the office of the cemetery, and she helps. There's her contact appears in that on that webpage. So just look through there, the Association of Łódź Jews, and you'll be able to connect to them. Okay. Okay, what happens to Łódź Jews after the war? One of the interesting things that happened after the end of the war, because Warsaw is in ruins, after the uprising, the Warsaw Uprising in August 1944, the Polish uprising, and the Germans' intention not to leave a stone one stone normally standing in Warsaw, the Jewish center till Warsaw is revived is in Łódź. The survivors mostly come there after the war. This is the largest Jewish concentration after the war, where you can see the different Jewish parties also gather, as well as the youth movements. After I'm sure you're familiar with the wave of pogroms that took place between 1945 and 1947 as part of the internal war that was taking part within Poland at that time. And following Kielce pogrom in July 1946, the place those who survives the pogrom that they are evicted to is to Łódź. And maybe to contradict part of the common understanding that majority of Polish Jews eventually left Poland after the war, one of the interesting and important things to mention is that there's a Jewish community that remains, and they remain till today. Till today, when you arrive to Łódź, you can meet some of those descendants who remained in Łódź and never left after the war because their home was seen as Poland. It's true also to other cities. One of the people who will become very known, who will move actually from Warsaw to Łódź, will become a very known cardiologist. And he was one of the commanders of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and that is Marek Edelman, who also will be very active in solidarity movement in the fight, the Polish fight for their independence in the 70s and 80s. And he lived in Łódź till he passed away in 2009. So this is regarding that. There was another question regarding David Gertler, which I'd like to relate. And that is, I mentioned him only briefly. David Gertler was in charge of the Zondel. The Zondel is a group that was defined by the Nazis, a very small group of a few dozens of Jews who actually, their official position was to locate smugglers and exploitation and so on within the ghetto. But in practice, they were also known as such as Gestapo agents. But David Gertler was also in charge of the supply office within the ghetto. And when you look at the documentation from the time, and not only with reflections and documentation and testimonies which were given after the Holocaust, one of the interesting things that we can find is that he is seen in an ambivalent way. Some see him as a savior because of the way that he provides the supply in the ghetto, and some see him as a Gestapo agent. With the deportation, the turning point in September 1942, when he's raised more by the Gestapo over Romkowski, he becomes very prominent. But in July 1943, the Germans will deport him to a concentration camp because they feel he has too much power. He will survive. He will move to Munich. He will be brought to court, to a Jewish court in the late 40s in Germany, and will be acquitted because they will say, we do not have enough documentation. And he would live and pass away if I'm not mistaken, in the late 50s. So one of the things maybe we can see here from this story of David Gertler is the fact that we have a very clear black and white during the Holocaust, but the gray zone is very vast. And this is something also that we have to keep in our memory regarding how do we relate to the whereabouts during the Holocaust and the choices that people had made. Okay, let me see if there's something else. And if not, with that, I will end. Okay, I think I covered most of the questions. Okay, so I'll stop here. Thank you very much for attending. And I hope that I managed to bring something new to you, and all the best.